Welcome to this first public lecture of the Emancipatory Future Studies in the Anthropocene project. The EFS project is a new knowledge project at Wits University, and as I said yesterday, it's all about the subaltern, it's about the plebeian, it's about the wretched of the earth, and their imaginings of a different kind of world, their visioning, their anticipatory modes of thinking, and so on. The project has various research thrusts in it. We are looking at climate temporality and how to kind of grapple with that in an emancipatory way, a world bereft of certainties, and how we understand change. It's about decolonial futures and trying to think beyond the Eurocentric or Euro-American standard of what is emancipation. It's about eco-utopia and eco-dystopia, and to use these devices as means to kind of stimulate critical thinking, thinking about the present, thinking about the future. It's about systemic pathways into the future. So without blueprinting, how do we build the next society, the next civilization, and so on. It's also about grand ecocentric futures. So thinking on a macro scale about how we bring society together to move in a particular direction. The social contract of the second half of the 20th century is gone, and it's basically been reduced to the sovereignty of capital. So we are living in a world in which it's being remade in the image of capital. So grand ecocentric futures are about challenging that. So that's the research agenda of this project. For those of you who don't know me, as I'm a principal investigator for this project, but I'm also an associate professor of international relations at this university, and my name is Vishwas Saka. We have had several exciting scholars on this platform, but we're kicking off this year, and activists, and this year we are kicking off with Ashish Kothari from India. Yesterday, Ashish, I'm confusing with my nephew, Atish. Ashish ran a seminar, and he kind of took us into the world of conservation and the work he's done with the IUCN internationally. And he kind of pointed to the kind of imaginings and emancipatory practices, particularly in the Indian context, that he has been involved with mapping and supporting and so on. So we're really proud and honored to have Ashish with us here today to give his public lecture. Ashish is the founder member of Kalpa Vriksh. He's also part of many movements. He's taught at the Indian Institute of Public Administration. He's coordinated India's National Biodiversity Strategy and Action Plan. He has served on the boards of Greenpeace International and Greenpeace India. He's been part of the ICCA Consortium, a judge on the International Tribunal on the Rights of Nature. He helps coordinate Vikalp Sangam and the Global Tapestry of Alternatives and Radical Ecological Democracy. He's the co-author and co-editor of Churning the Earth, Alternative Futures, and Pluriverse, a Post-Development Dictionary. Over to you.
Thanks a lot, Vish, and thanks to the university for this opportunity. Since we have about an hour and a half, so I'll speak about 35 to 40 minutes, and then we can open up for discussion. But while I'm speaking, if there's something that I say which is not clear, then just shout out and ask me to clarify things. Okay, so that's fine with me if you interrupt in the middle. But otherwise, we'll have at least hopefully 35 to 40 minutes of Q&A at the end. All right. I think the context in which I'm making this presentation, which is looking at what could be emancipatory futures or ecocentric futures, as we call them, is of course a context we're all familiar with. I'm not going to belabor this point about the kind of multiple crises that we are facing from local to global. These are staring at us in our face. These are already affecting hundreds of millions of people in many different ways, not just climate, but all kinds of different crises that we are seeing. One of the things that we have realized back in India, and I'm sure is also part of your realization here across the global south, is that part of the story with regard to these global crises is how development itself is viewed. So if you look at development and its exclusive focus on economic growth at any cost, it literally is at any cost. As you see, for instance, in this advertisement from an Indian multinational corporation which talks about ripping through jungles in Indonesia, moving the earth in India to lay pipelines, and essentially saying that if nature is in the way of development and progress, it has to be shoved aside. And there's something essentially wrong in the way in which we've actually thought of human progress, and in the last few decades of the word development itself, which is especially post-World War II. And in a way, the way I look at it is to say that we're actually moving from, this development actually is not just destroying a lot of the rest of nature, but also those communities who are most dependent on nature. It's fishing communities, farmer communities, pastoralists, hunter-gatherers, etc. And in that sense that it's destroying livelihoods, that is to say they're not jobs. What a farmer does on the farm is not a job, it's a livelihood. It's linked to ecology, to culture, to social relations, etc., etc. And what we're doing is now moving away from that, destroying those and moving into industrialized mass production jobs for the most part, for the majority of the population that is getting jobs in the new sector, and which are not creative, which are extremely soul deadening. And in that sense, I say that we're moving from livelihoods to deadlihoods, destroying those livelihoods and creating jobs which are delinked from, which is why, for instance, we have the phenomenon of the weekday and the weekend. We never had that traditionally. Farmers not saying it's Sunday, so I'm not going to go and sow my plants or harvest my crops. But today we have that, and that's why we desperately wait for the weekend and we desperately wait for vacations. It's all a creation of this movement towards what I call deadlihoods, or what David Graeber, the anthropologist, called bullshit jobs. We know all of this. We are aware of the fact that we are already crossing multiple ecological and planetary boundaries. We're seeing that with the kind of devastation that's taking place across the world, including here in South Africa, back home in India. So these are familiar stories. What we're also increasingly familiar with is that the same growth story or the same model of development has also significantly increased inequalities across all societies. In India, for instance, the richest 5% of the country, of the population, owns more than 90% of the wealth. I don't know what the South African figures are, probably somewhat similar. And those are the global figures, and you can see for yourself what that what that sort of champagne glass actually looks like from the point of view of those who get left out of this so-called progress and development. We're also seeing that actually the same process is to my mind, actually, instead of enhancing and increasing the possibilities of democracy, which is what development was supposed to bring, the promise of increasing democracy, we're seeing in many different parts of the world how democracy is actually shrinking, spaces are shrinking. In India, as an example, we see that very hard-fought civil society spaces, for instance, public hearings whenever a development project has to be built, or spaces in doing environmental impact assessments or social impact assessments, are systematically being removed from the law books and from the policies in the name of ease of doing business, right? And again, I'm sure it's similar here in South Africa. We also know that globally, when people defend their territories against mining, extractivism, big dams, etc., they are often killed or imprisoned or beaten up or harassed, and in many different ways, either the state or corporations, and very often the two together, are hitting back at this kind of voices of democracy. And finally, we've seen in the last 3 years, this very interesting period that we've just gone through, how the COVID pandemic has been used as an excuse by governments to become more authoritarian in the name of surveillance and health, making sure health measures are in place, etc., etc. But also corporations, especially those who work online businesses as an example, to become even more profit-seeking and profit-hungry. You can see the figure of how much money a few billionaires have made in just actually the first 1.5 years of the COVID pandemic. There is, however, the counter side to that, and that's what I'd like to focus on for most of the presentation, which is how people have also, during the COVID pandemic, as in any other crisis that we have faced in the past, gone out of their comfort zones to help other people. Young people helping the elderly, people who are healthy helping those who have actually been affected by COVID, or even worse, by the economic lockdowns that were imposed by many governments. So expressions of solidarity in the midst of crisis is something that I think we really need to look at, to focus on, to see how can those signs of hope actually be understood, enhanced and made much larger to move towards the kind of emancipatory futures that we want. Because one of the biggest questions that's being asked of us, those of us who critique, who resist, who critique, who protest against the current forms of development, economic growth, governance, etc., are asked this question, okay, but you're saying no to this, no to that, no to this, no to that, what are you saying yes to? What's your answer? What's your solution to meeting human needs and aspirations? People are hungry, people don't have jobs. What are your answers to that? And so this question of alternatives to the currently dominant system is a very, very crucial one that we really need to deal with, and actually haven't done enough work on, because a lot of what civil society has focused on, a lot of what critical academia has also focused on, is the critiques, is critiquing the current system. That's absolutely necessary, we need to keep doing that. But also, I think we need equal focus on the alternatives. And I'm going to talk about two kinds of alternatives, both of which are equally important. One is people's resistance on the ground, where people are saying enough is enough. This is an image from about 30 years back from central India, where indigenous people, what we call the Adivasis, or the original peoples in India, protested against two mega hydroelectricity projects which were coming up on this river, Indravati. And in that protest, it was very interesting, there were sort of two narratives coming out. One was a narrative of how we don't want to be displaced, we don't want our villages to be submerged, we don't want the forests that you see in the background there to be drowned out. We want to continue living the livelihoods we are living. But secondly, also saying that for you, for the government, the river is megawatts, it is hydroelectricity, it is power, it is a commodified entity. For us, the river is our mother. And it is what has given life to us. And if our mother is threatened by your actions, we will do everything possible to defend it. So what we see in these acts of resistance is fundamental challenges, not just to the individual acts of dispossession and displacement, but to the structures which actually enable or which create these kinds of development projects in the first place. Which are the structures of, whether it's depending on which society you're in, capitalist domination, state domination, patriarchy of course in all societies, racism, casteism in India, etc. And what these movements, or many others around the world, are actually showing to us that there are other ways of doing, being, acting, dreaming, behaving. We don't have to go the Western industrialized modernist way across the world. We have other ways of doing things, some emerging from the past, some in new ways. So whether it's the anti-racism movements in North America, it's the iconic farmers movement in India, which forced the government to withdraw 3 extremely obnoxious laws over a year of street protests, or it's the peace movements in many parts of the world, it's the movement against the military junta in Burma, Myanmar, it's the youth climate justice movements, it's the movement for a new constitution in Chile. You actually see across these that it's not just protest, but also showing other ways of being and doing and behaving and acting and dreaming. And that is then taken forward by another kind of alternative, which I'll come to in a minute. Why it's very important for us to actually see movements responding not just to individual projects, but to the structures and relations that underlie what is behind the model of development and economic growth, is because it is those same structures that are today giving us what they say to be solutions. If you look at the climate negotiations, or recently concluded biodiversity negotiation in Montreal. They're all coming with these either technical fixes or managerial fixes or market fixes or things like compensation. And okay, we emit some certain carbon here, we'll catch it somewhere else, so zero carbon. We lose biodiversity somewhere, we're going to replace it somewhere else. One of the most ridiculous ones that just come out of India, for instance, is 130 square kilometers of completely untouched evergreen rainforest and mangroves in the Nicobar Islands in the southernmost part of India, is being destroyed for an airport, a port, a shipping facility, and an industrial township. And in its place, the government is saying, well, yeah, we're losing that, but we're planting 260 square kilometers of what they call forest, which is in central India, a very completely different ecosystem, a dry habitat, etc. And it will essentially be maybe 3 or 4 species of plantation, whereas we're losing hundreds of species here. So it's that kind of offsets, the kind of what they call compensatory afforestation in India, whether it's to do with biodiversity or climate or any of these things, that you're actually seeing these kinds of very superficial solutions being given to us, which really have to be challenged. And the only way to challenge them is to say they're actually coming from the same structures, and the only thing they're sustaining in terms of being sustainable is the structures themselves, not the earth or not peoples who are dependent on the earth. So the second kind of alternative, which is in some sense linked to the resistance as alternative, is the building of constructive processes across the world to meet basic human needs or to meet aspirations in ways that are not crashing the earth and in ways that are not creating such incredible levels of inequality and conflict and deprivation and so on. There are tens of thousands of these all across the world. I'm going to give a glimpse of a few of them that I'm familiar with, and there's that book which I'll introduce at the end. I have a copy of it here if somebody wants, which has 100 examples from different parts of the world. So just a glimpse, okay, each of these is worth several hours of description. I'm going to just do it in 1 minute each, so I'm sorry for that, it's going to be very simplistic. But this is, for me personally, this has been the most inspiring one from India. In southern India, 5,000 women farmers who belong to the Dalits, that is the so-called untouchables or outcasts of Hindu society, the most oppressed section of Indian society, both as women and as Dalits. Used to face a situation of hunger, malnutrition, no access to education, health facilities, etc., social ostracization, marginalization of various different kinds. Till they started gathering themselves into women's committees in about 75 villages, and then a federation of these women's sanghas, as they call them, or committees, called the Deccan Development Society, beginning to reject the chemical-based, hybrid seed-based agriculture that the government was asking them to follow, and saying, no, we want to go back to our traditional agriculture, which is organic, which is biologically diverse. They are growing 75 different species of crops, species and varieties of crops, going back to the old grains of India, the oldest grains of India, the various different varieties of millets, not just rice and wheat, which was pushed in by the so-called Green Revolution in India, and collectivizing a lot of their operations, sharing seeds, sharing knowledge, not privatizing anything at all, and through that actually achieving full security, food security for 5,000 families, much better nutrition status, income from selling a few things in the market, and so therefore also access to health education facilities and so on, but also moving to food sovereignty. And this is a crucial thing that they have been arguing. We don't want only security, we want sovereignty over everything to do with food, because we want full control over seeds, land, knowledge, and water. Also fighting for land rights for women, which is very unusual in India. This is an amazing story. I can go on and on. They also have a community media station. They run their own radio station. They make their own films. They run their own school and a lot else. Okay, across to the other side of the world, a somewhat similar story in a very different ecological and cultural context. This is the Andes, the highlands of the Andes in Peru, where the Quechua indigenous people have been governing a large, what they call biocultural landscape, which is also where the potato originated, conserving and growing more than 1,300 varieties of potato. I was there in 2008, and when they showed me about 100 different varieties, I was like, what? Because in India we have maybe 1 or 2 varieties. So I'd never seen There were purple ones and red ones and grey ones and small ones and big ones, and there was a mother-in-law potato which was very convoluted, and apparently it's a test for the daughter-in-law to be able to peel it without breaking any of it, etc. So it was just incredible. But anyways, through actually this kind of governance, especially with the women and their knowledge, they have also achieved not just food security but food sovereignty. Incidentally, both in the previous case and in this case, during the entire COVID period, there was absolutely no problems of health and hunger in these communities. They were fully aware of what was happening, and because they had food security locally, not dependent on somebody outside, there was no issue of food scarcity. In fact, in both cases, they were providing food relief to outside the community, those who needed it. A little bit in the same area, in the Ecuadorian region of the Sapara nation in the Amazon. This community has been struggling to maintain its cultural identity in the midst of, again, extractivist projects coming in from the government, including from the so-called revolutionary government of Korea, and fighting against oil mining, oil exploration, mining, etc., retaining and taking back complete control, legal control over a very large part of the Amazon, and then trying to negotiate their relationship with the modern world by doing things like community-led health tourism, where people from outside actually come and spend a few days, learn about their own ways of how they deal with health, which is also in relation to all of nature, all of which have spirits. So actually saying that it's not just human beings who have spirits, but the rocks, the river, the trees, the animals, everybody has spirits. And when we talk about health, we need to take all of that into consideration. So it's a very interesting aspect. They're also trying to revive their language, which was more or less destroyed by outside influence, and a lot more. And actually, if you look at thousands of examples of what are now called territories of life, where indigenous peoples or other local communities are trying to retain, sustain the natural ecosystems in which they live, in traditional ways or in new ways where the traditional systems have gone defunct. There's the ICC Consortium is an organization I belong to, which has documented hundreds of examples of this and put together, there's more than 150 peoples and organizations that are part of that consortium. Coming into Central Western Asia, this is for me also a very, very inspiring example. Haven't yet gone there, I'm hoping to go there next year, of an attempt to create a large zone of peace with radical local democracy and eco-feminist ideology in the midst of what is possibly one of the longest standing areas of war and conflict in the world. That is the Iran, Iraq, Syria, Turkey quarterly junction, right? From where millions of people have also fled as refugees, and right now is suffering from this earthquake, this devastating earthquake. So in the midst of that kind of a regime, and also in the midst of what was an intensely patriarchal society, in the space of about 30 to 35 years, actually moving significantly towards trying to achieve this kind of peace with eco-feminist and radical democracies, I think is an incredible achievement. Currently very severely threatened because Turkey is bombing them. You know, everybody's focusing on Ukraine and Russia, but actually there's a war going on right now. Probably because the earthquake currently is stalled, but otherwise before that Turkey was bombing Kurdistan. They don't want Kurdistan to be an independent territory. Incidentally also Kurdistan, the freedom movement has said we don't want a Kurdish state, nation state. We don't believe in the state. So actually the entire region there is no state. There's a coordination mechanism, and I'll come back to that later when I talk about this notion of democracy. Back to India, in central India, the same Adivasis, indigenous peoples who were part of the agitation against the mega dams I spoke about earlier, have since then also moved towards much more local self-governance or self-determination. And in the process of fighting with the state, when they're seeking self-determination and trying to stop mining, also saying that within our own societies there are problems. Even within indigenous peoples, for instance, in the official decision-making processes of the village, women don't take part. And so why is that the case? If we're fighting for equality with the state, we need to fight for equality inside also. So also questioning themselves even as they're questioning those who are exploiting them from outside. Europe. So very interesting examples of non-capitalist economy, social and solidarity economy as it's called, in the midst of intensely capitalist societies. This factory in Greece, for instance, 30 to 40 workers who run that, it's a olive oil based industrial production, where they run the factory completely democratically. There's a huge slogan on the wall saying, "We have no boss." Everybody is part of decision making, and every worker gets exactly the same wage per hour of work as every other worker. Right? So that's the kind of non-capitalist, much more solidarity-based system they're trying to work towards. That school on the right-hand side is run with very cheap fees but very high-quality teaching, and the reason they're able to do that is because the entire community around them helps in administration and teaching without charging fees. I mean, people put in, say, 5 hours of work every month, teaching or administration, without charging fees. So in that sense, the school runs with very low amounts of money. There are things like alternative currencies, where the people are trying to break away from, to some extent at least, break away from the dominance of the euro or the dollar, or in our case the rupee, where they're saying, why can't we actually do a lot of our local exchanges and stimulate the local economy through that, using our own money or our own means of exchange. So you actually see movements of this kind, of course, both in rural areas and in urban areas. So for instance, the movements for the right to the city, the right to live with dignity in the city. So this is an example from Western India, where several of the poorer sections of the city have actually mobilized themselves with the help of some civil society organizations to rebuild their colonies from being squatter settlements to being much more dignified settlements, taking control over the water, trying to do renewable energy projects, taking control over the waste management, and a whole bunch of other things, actually essentially saying that why should the city be governed by somebody other than those who are living in it. So if I'm living in this colony, I should be at the core of decision making and not some bureaucrat or some politician who's deciding the city's budget or the plans. Interesting experiments across different parts of the world. This is Christiania, a fairly old attempt at trying to do anarchic living in the middle of Copenhagen, where there's no private property and all the businesses are run through cooperatives. There's a lot more. Yesterday or day before, Vish, you told me about some of the urban movements that are happening here with food sovereignty, including this university, I believe, and cooperatives, much more neighborhood assemblies, for instance, many of the cities in Brazil or in Colombia, and in UK, what started as transition towns, trying to build, recommon a lot of spaces, for instance, convert car parks into parks, right, as in urban gardens, where people can actually do, collectively do gardening and even some amount of farming. And there's a movement of feminist municipalism, which is also very interesting, such as, for instance, what's been happening in Barcelona over the last few years, where a woman mayor has tried to actually create a governance model or a system which is very different from what her predecessors were doing, much more based on solidarity rather than hostile competition, and listening to communities on the ground, neighborhood assemblies on the ground. I mentioned earlier with regard to two of the examples of how many of these communities were able to cope with the COVID crisis much better than others. In India, we had a very, very severe crisis with both the first and the second wave of COVID, when the government imposed sudden economic lockdowns. Millions of workers were out of jobs. They really had no job. In fact, not just out of jobs, there was no transportation to take them back home. You may have seen videos or images of this, of people walking 1,000 kilometers just to get back home with no job and no food, and just relying on whatever they could get on the way. Now that's the kind of crises that a lot of communities faced. But there were also others who actually coped much better, but we've been trying to investigate why was that the case. We put 70 case studies together of where communities were able to be much more resilient because they had collective control over their livelihood resources. A lot of their economic exchanges were localized, not long distance. Food was being locally grown, and or they had other means by which they could actually cope and survive and thrive much better. We've also done about 20 examples from other parts of the world of this kind of COVID time resilience. I can send around links to all of these. They're all available on our websites. You can download them for free. Okay, I'll spend the last 5 or 10 minutes looking at the kinds of, from these individual examples, and there are, as I said, tens of thousands of them. What are the kind of frameworks of alternative futures or emancipatory futures that are emerging? What's already happening, but also what more needs to happen? So we've built up this sort of way of looking at these scenarios through what we call a flower of transformation, looking at 5 petals or 5 spheres of life: the political, the economic, the social, the cultural, the ecological, and seeing what kind of changes, transformations are already being happening on the ground and what more needs to happen. We know this is a bit of an artificial separation, but being in an academic institution, I'm sure you're all comfortable with that. We all do, these artificial things. So basically just an attempt to try to understand what's happening on the ground. We know that in real life, of course, these are all enmeshed, intermeshed, intersectional, and not separate. But just to give a quick example, a quick glimpse of what some of these changes are. So if you look at, for instance, democracy, for the last so many decades, we've thought of democracy as elections. And you get a party in power, and you tear your hair out because that party doesn't do the right thing, then you search for another political party, and then you tear your hair out. Maybe some parties are good and they do the right thing, but in most cases we know that centralized governments really don't deliver as we want them to. So what these movements are saying is that democracy is about us claiming power where we are. The slogan of that Central Indian movement I spoke to you about was, we elect the government in New Delhi and Mumbai. In our village, we are the government. Nobody else will take decisions for our village except us. And the government is welcome to be involved, and we will make the government accountable for what they're supposed to give us, but they will not dictate to us what should happen in our villages. So it's maybe the original meaning of democracy, power of the people, right? But it has been lost in our liberal forms of democracy, and it's what's coming back in these movements. But then you also need institutions of governance at larger scale. Johannesburg will still need some kind of a city level governance. How do you make that accountable to the urban neighborhoods on the ground is what also these movements are trying to build in, which is things like, for instance, the right to recall if a representative is not doing what is supposed to be done. Frequent rotation of, you don't wait 5 years, you can actually rotate every year, for instance, so that everybody gets a chance to be in these representative institutions. Public audits, referendums. There are many different ways by which people are trying to do this in different parts of the world. A third very interesting aspect of this new politics would be the questioning of political boundaries, current, especially nation-state political boundaries. In South Asia, we have been split because of colonial rule into 3 or 4 different countries, which was one subcontinent. Right? In Africa, you know the experience much better than me. I always, when I was younger, I used to look at the Africa map and I said, why are these boundaries so square? Like, how do you have these straight lines between countries? So only later I realized what Europeans had done in terms of making the nation states here. So South Asia, it's currently split into 6-7 countries. Some are pre-colonial times, some are post, some are because of colonization. That's the political map, right? If you look at the biogeographical map, or the ecological map of it, just to give you 2 examples. The Gangetic Plains with the Ganges and all its tributaries cuts through India, Nepal and Bangladesh. The Indus cuts through, actually its origins are in Tibet, cuts through India and then into Pakistan. Now if India is to build a dam on the Indus, Pakistan is going to suffer. India already has a barrage on the Ganga, on the Ganges, because of which Bangladesh is suffering. China is building a huge dam up here, and most of the river actually flows through India, and Indians are going to suffer. We are actually, because of nation-state boundaries where we are cutting ecological flows, we are also cutting cultural flows. People who used to be able to migrate back and forth between India and Ladakh in India and Tibet, they used to be migratory, nomadic populations. There used to be trade. The Silk Route, for instance, very famous Silk Route, was going through much of those areas. Now there's a fence and army on both sides. You can't do that anymore. Wildlife can also not flow back and forth. So can we start reimagining political boundaries from ecological and cultural perspectives. It's a huge challenge, and sometimes we can't even imagine it, but actually it is something we really need to do. And some peoples are already beginning to practice that. In Latin America, for instance, 30 indigenous nations of what is today Peru and Ecuador have declared a 60 million hectare Amazon sacred headwaters bioregion. And they're saying we don't recognize the Ecuador-Peruvian border. For us, the entire Amazon is one unit, but we do have our own borders in terms of our indigenous nations, but they're porous, and we want to actually try and see what that bioregion would look like. Then we talk about new economics. And again, there's a whole bunch of things happening here, right? So for instance, you go back to the COVID pandemic, and why communities were resilient is where they had localized economies, not globalized ones, where at least all the basic needs were able to be met in a certain local region. This becomes so important, for instance, especially with the climate crisis, because the kind of crisis we saw with COVID is going to happen more and more and more with climate breakdowns, where production is not in the hands of capitalists, but in the hands of actual workers, people who are actually putting in the hard labor of producing whatever has to be produced, whether it's on the farm or it's in a factory. And in fact, where we don't even separate ourselves as producers and consumers. I think it was Marx who said that, what, a critic in the morning, a farmer in the afternoon. I don't remember the exact phrase. You might remember. Patrick sitting there, I'm sure he remembers the exact phrase, what Marx said. But essentially what he was saying, and what Gandhi said, and many others were saying, was that why should we have this separation between somebody who's a worker and somebody who's a consumer, or somebody who is an intellectual and somebody who's putting in physical labor? We can be all of these things, or many of these things ourselves. Reintegrating work and leisure, I mentioned the weekend and the weekday. Can we break that down? If all of us are doing work we enjoy, and that's the economy we have to create, then do we really need to desperately wait for vacations? We're enjoying the work. We can take a break whenever we want, we can do something else. So that's really the kind of economy we're looking at. The recommoning of private property, such as the example I gave you of transition towns and many others, and of course bringing back relations of caring and sharing. The fundamentals of any economy are actually non-monetary. They are about how we care for each other. How women, for instance, provide incredible care in the domestic economy, right, without any recognition in the formal economy. Or what the Gibsons in Australia have called the community economies, which are hiding under the carpet of the formal economy, but are actually as, if not more, important. How do we bring that back into our consciousness and in recognition? Spheres 3 and 4 are about social justice, cultural diversity, because unless we also deal with gender inequalities or casteism in India, or who has ability and who has disability, the whole politics of disability, for instance, or racism, we are also going to leave very, very large sections of population out. So the struggles for justice and the struggles for retaining our knowledge and cultural diversity. All the examples that I gave are where people have asserted their own knowledge systems, their own cultures, and built on that, not refusing outside, not being xenophobic and saying, I'm not going to learn anything from outside, saying, yeah, I will also learn from outside, but I won't allow my systems to be displaced. Gandhi put it very nicely. He said, I want the windows and the doors of my house to be open for the winds of all cultures to flow through, but I refuse to be blown off my feet by any of those winds. So I'm rooted in my own culture and ecology, etc., but I'm also learning from others and giving what I can to them. So that kind of, those kinds of struggles for sustaining diversity and sustaining knowledge in the commons, not privatizing it, not copyright, but copyleft, is what is also very much part of peace transformation. And finally, of course, sphere 5 is how do we reintegrate ourselves within the rest of nature. Not this separation between humans and nature, but humans and the rest of nature. We are also an animal like many others. And instead of this kind of hierarchy here, which as you can see is not just a biological hierarchy, but also a social one with the man on top and the woman below. This is what I learned in my biology class in school. I don't know if you guys did biology, what you learned. But then going to what has been the indigenous notion all along of a circle of life. where all species are equal. And then at the core of this flower of transformation is, I think, what for me has been the most important learning from all these examples, which is what are the basic ethics and values that emerge from them. How do we learn those ethics and values? Not about moralizing, not about preaching, but saying, okay, if for instance those Dalit women farmers were able to achieve that incredible revolution in agriculture, food sovereignty, it is because they worked as collectives. It is because they shared. It's because they expressed solidarity. It's because they were not competitive about who gets more production and who gets less production. It's not because they were through education. They did go through probably education, but then they left it behind, where each one of us is taught in school, you have to come first. It doesn't matter if everybody else fails. How do we transform those sorts of values or non-values into this set of values? Even for instance, the dignity of physical labor. Why is it that those who write about agriculture are paid more than those who actually work on the farm and produce the food that we eat? So all of that has to be changed, and this is the sort of set of ethics and principles that we have learned from many of these communities, and essentially putting together into what we call worldviews that celebrate not money, not fame, not power, but life. Life in all of its complexity, all of its diversity, all of its wonders. That is what we really are looking at in terms of radical futures. Alright, we have also, for those of you who like, who are into academics, we have also used this flower of transformation as a self-assessment tool. I can send it to you. There's a whole separate tool on that with 100 sort of indicators and questions of how you can look at, if any transformation or change is taking place, how can we assess whether it's holistic, whether it's internally contradictory, whether you're doing good stuff in one but then inadvertently actually harming something else, etc. Alright, finally then, looking at what are the worldviews that celebrate life, which we already have and which we can build on. So in India there's a notion called Swaraj, or a worldview called Swaraj, which means, badly translated, self-rule, but essentially saying that we will fight for our own freedoms, we will fight for our own autonomy, but not in a way that undermines your freedom and your autonomy and your happiness and your well-being. So it's not at all the American notion of freedom. It is a very different notion of freedom and democracy, which is rights but also responsibilities. Autonomy with restraints, so that nobody else suffers. And we've extended that to actually including the rest of nature in this, so Swaraj and eco-Swaraj. And a radical democracy where all of us are part of decision making, but we are also ecologically responsible and socially responsible in that decision making process, where the community, the collective on the ground is the unit of decision, the basic unit of decision making, but with, as I said, a sense of responsibility towards within the community, but also outside. There are similar notions across the world. Here, of course, in Africa, you have so many different variations of Ubuntu, etc., etc. I'm sure many of you are much more familiar with this than I am. But also in other parts of the world where people are actually bringing those ancient indigenous notions back into current movements. And anti-extractivist movements, for instance, are talking about buen vivir in Latin America in a way that is indigenously rooted, not in a way the government is talking about it. Because unfortunately, all of these are also subject to hijacking, to co-optation by the state or by corporations. Because like for instance, all corporations today are talking we are eco-friendly. The word eco has got prefixed to virtually everything now. Eco-friendly, eco-tourism, eco-this, eco-that. So kind of automatically, or smart, as in Yakov, your study, right? So these are terms that are being picked up and hijacked, so we need to be very aware of that. But also what's happening, I think, is that there's a whole bunch of very interesting worldviews or philosophies or ideologies or approaches coming from within the belly of the beast, within capitalist societies, such as degrowth in Europe, ecofeminism in many parts of the world, including here in South Africa with women and many others. So I think what we need to do is to actually understand those movements, those worldviews, those practices on the ground, and argue for not just Green New Deals, because while they are better than conventional economics, many of the Green New Deals in the United States, UK, Europe, South Korea are actually still constrained within a certain way of looking at things. They don't look at, for instance, global north-south equality. For instance, they push, instead of fossil fuel cars, they push for electric cars. And we know from experience of mining in Africa or Chile or elsewhere that electric cars are not necessarily much better news than fossil fuel cars. So how do we actually move towards rainbow new deals, towards multiple, or what I think you people are calling climate just transitions, right? Or just just transitions in climate. How do we move to which encompasses the social, economic, political, cultural, ecological in one sort of holistic vision of transformation. There's lots of questions I have, and I'm sure all of we have. None of us has all the answers. Things like, okay, should there still be a state? If so, what would it be its role? Or right now we do have a state. What should it be? What should be its ideal role? If we have to go beyond nation states, then we also then have to go beyond the United Nations. What will global governance look like? Will there be like a United Peoples of the world or something else? How do universities change? Instead of having sociology and geography and biology and blah blah blah, all of that, how do we actually have much more interchangeable, flowing subjects, right? Where we can actually be learning many things together and looking at the intersectionalities. And then this question of how do we achieve scale. This is something I always get asked. You've got all these fantastic examples, but how do you change the macro picture? And there, again, a few thoughts. Instead of saying I'm going to copy what the Dalit women farmers are doing or the Quechua indigenous people are doing in my own area, I learn the lessons, learn the principles, the values, and then see how I can apply those in my own context with whatever modifications are necessary. And then link up with the Dalit women and the Quechua is a horizontal network of solidarity. And that is what creates scale. And that's beginning to happen with things like sustainable smallholder-based agriculture. It has already happened with, say, the feminist movement. In many ways, if you look at it, there were scattered feminist movements in many parts of the world 100 years back. Today, much more global solidarity is able to achieve much more than was possible through the scattered initiatives. So we need all of this. We also, of course, then need advocacy for policy shifts in order to make it much more possible for these sorts of ground-level transformations to take place. Two processes that we use, one in India, one globally, where we're trying to actually bring a lot of these movements, organizations, individuals together to learn from each other. So this is in India. This started in 2014. There are almost 100 organizations and movements across the country who are involved, working on all these different aspects of life and trying to see how do we, again, as a movement also, how do we become much more intersectional. You may be doing fantastic work on alternative education. I might be doing good work on alternative agriculture, but we've never actually spoken to each other and said, look, how do we build alternative agricultural scenarios into education, and how can your thing help me? So kind of building those sorts of bridges and also to create more of a critical mass to affect policy shifts, to resist regressive policies and forces, right? So we've had more than about, I think almost about 30 physical gatherings across the country, trying to do all this kind of thing, and we've been collecting stories. For me, actually, stories and storytelling is the most important way of helping to achieve transformation. Instead of boring lectures like what I'm just giving, actually telling stories of what's happening on the ground and enabling people who are making these transformations tell the stories themselves is really the most important. So this is a website which has about almost 2,000 such stories from different parts of India, in written form, with films, with audio, etc. Building on that, we also then connected with similar networks in different parts of the world, especially Colombia, Mexico, Southeast Asia, to create this global tapestry of alternatives in 2019. Again, a sort of horizontal weaving of radical alternatives, not sort of one super organization which then dictates things from above. We have about 60 global regional movements, including several from Africa, that are endorsers of this global tapestry. And we also have what we call weavers, that is those who are actually doing the networking in their own countries or their regions. Right now, 4 such weavers, a 5th from Germany might join, and we're missing Africa. So anybody has ideas on how maybe there could be weavers in Southern Africa, that could actually join this process. This is a website which has stories from all over the world. Started also in around 2015-16. Please do take a look. There's some really fascinating stories of fundamental transformations taking place in all the continents. With that, so a couple of books. This is a book that I mentioned which has 100 examples of radical alternatives in different parts of the world. It's now available in 5-6 languages, including Spanish, Portuguese, Italian, French. And this is an interesting experiment we did, because I think you spoke about this might be interesting if you have not already done it. We asked 40 people who are experienced with different aspects of life: gender and sexuality, conservation, education, health, indigenous people, pastoralism, etc. to imagine India in 2100, an ideal India, a utopian India, and then come back to now and say, okay, how do we get there? What are the pathways? What do we already know that's happening? What more do we need to do to get there? So it's a process of imagining, but also based on current real life. Very interesting experiment we did. So that's the book. And since I mentioned utopia, I'm going to end with this quote of, this is an Argentinian filmmaker, Fernando Birri, who was quoted by the famous writer Edward Italiano. So he says, utopia is on the horizon. I move 2 steps closer, it moves 2 steps further away. I walk another 10 steps and utopia runs 10 steps further away. As much as I may walk, I never reach it. So what's the point of utopia? The point is exactly this: it makes us continuously advance in a direction in which we hope there is emancipation, true progress, and justice, equality, and ecological sustainability. Thank you.
Okay, so we'll open it up for comments, questions, engagements. Who wants to go?